In May of last year, Missouri partnered with the state of Louisiana and private plaintiffs to file a landmark lawsuit against dozens of officials in the federal government to stop the biggest violation of the First Amendment in this nation's history. My office obtained more than 20,000 pages of evidence detailing extraordinary censorship efforts by a variety of officials within the federal government. My office also deposed key witnesses, including Dr. Anthony Fauci and officials from the FBI, State Department, Department of Homeland Security, Office of the Surgeon General, and the CDC. The evidence that we've uncovered only begins to scratch the surface of these First Amendment violations. Ultimately, the lawsuit is about obtaining truth and accountability. Last month, a federal judge heard oral argument on a motion for preliminary injunction filed by plaintiffs in this case. The judge expressed skepticism over many of the federal government's responses to queries posed by the court, even likening the situation to George Orwell's novel 1984. Concerns have been noted by the United States Supreme Court. Justice Gorsuch recently opined that federal officials may have pressured social media companies to suppress information about the pandemic policies with which they disagreed. The 20,000 plus pages of documents my office has uncovered reveal that Justice Gorsuch's suspicions are in fact a sobering reality. The government's strategy to suppress speech in violation of the First Amendment is threefold. First, officials attempt to harm big tech companies by threatening to remove their legal protections or by issuing statements deeply harmful to the company's public image. Second, backed by previous threats, officials communicate behind doors with tech, flagging specific speech that officials dislike and badgering the companies to suppress that speech. Third, once officials have threatened tech companies and flagged specific content, the implicit promise arrives. If tech companies censor when asked, the government will back down from their public statements to harm the companies. As former White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki has boasted from the White House podium, they certainly understand what our asks are. And the censorship activities have grown so widespread that the Department of Homeland Security last year worked to create a disinformation governance board to coordinate efforts to censor between government agencies. Following these efforts, the court has characterized DHS as the nerve center of a federally directed censorship enterprise, as we saw in coordination between officials at DHS and the FBI in their attempt to silence the Hunter Biden laptop story in the weeks leading up to the 2020 election. Big tech companies have shown themselves eager to censor in recent years. It is also clear from the evidence that much of the speech affected would not have been removed but for the government's express involvement. The judicially misconstrued Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act has made it much easier for the government to create its vast censorship network by granting certain companies far more protection than Congress ever contemplated. The incorrectly interpreted Section 230 has enabled social media companies to consolidate control into the hands of a few enormously powerful actors. This consolidation reduces the pressure not to censor that would otherwise exist in a competitive market, while also making it much easier for federal officials to exercise pressure over the social media field. The federal government itself recognizes the legal problems with its actions. In an attempt to make it harder to detect their blatant legal violations, officials have begun outsourcing their censorship activities to pseudo-private organizations. Emails obtained reveal that officials believe this structure will help them evade liability under the First Amendment. But any federal attempt to censor speech is still unconstitutional. The government cannot do by indirect means what it would be prohibited from doing directly. The evidence also shows that federal censorship enterprise targets conservative voices. Last month, Biden's lawyers conceded in open court nearly all content suppressed by the federal government is conservative. This is not about truth. It's always been about power. Perhaps most troubling, Biden's lawyers recently shared with a judge that they have no plans to discontinue their censorship network. That admission makes this case one of the most important First Amendment cases in our nation's history. The freedom of speech enshrined in the First Amendment is the bedrock of this great nation. It's one of the fundamental rights guaranteed to all Americans. With this lawsuit, we're fighting to protect our liberties from all government interference. No government official has the right to tell us what to think, what to say, or what to hear. That's why this case is so important. The question of our time is whether Americans will enjoy the legacy of free speech handed down to us by the founding generation, or whether government will control what we say, what we hear, and how we debate the veracity of claims and arguments. We're locked in a pitched battle for the very character of our nation. If we do not prevail over the government officials who seek to control speech, millions of Americans will be left with what Justice Gorsuch has described as a shell of a democracy with civil liberties just as hollow. Thank you.
They banned drive-in church services and encouraged Kentuckians to report those who disobey. This hardly sounds like America. Unfortunately, these Orwellian policies and practices appear to have been carried out at the highest levels of our government. During this select subcommittee's hearing earlier this month, I asked Director Walensky a series of questions about the CDC's involvement in censoring discourse on social media. Director Walensky testified that she was unable to answer any of my questions about the CDC's involvement in online censorship due to it being under litigation in the courts. Attorney General Bailey, I understand you have active litigation against the Biden administration regarding their participation in online censorship. Is that right?
Yes, sir.
Attorney General, do you believe that CDC and other government officials or agencies worked with big tech to censor dissent about COVID vaccines?
Absolutely.
Did they ever recommend or encouraging censoring posts suggesting that vaccines prevent the spread of COVID-19?
There was an active suppression campaign as detailed in email exchanges between, at a minimum, the White House and big tech social media corporations from March to May of 2021, as recited by one of the other members and offered as evidence in our suit, that demonstrate that the target of the suppression was anyone that questioned the effectiveness of the vaccine.
So did they ever recommend or encouraging censoring individuals that dissented public views about vaccines?
Absolutely.
Do you believe that CDC or other government officials worked with private companies to influence the censorship of information about the origins of COVID-19?
Absolutely.
Did they ever recommend or encourage censoring posts suggesting that COVID-19 may come from a lab?
Yes.
Wow. Funny that you can answer my question, but Director Walensky cannot. According to documents released by your office, White House officials appear to have colluded directly with social media companies to censor and suppress opposing views related to COVID-19. One email appears to show White House Digital Director Robert Flattery telling Google that social media companies having a handle on vaccine hesitancy generally is a concern that is shared at the highest, and I mean highest, levels of the White House. Attorney General Bailey, do you believe it's constitutionally defensible for the White House to collude with social media companies to censor opposing scientific viewpoints?
No, that's targeted censorship by the government of core protected political speech.
So do you believe the Biden administration violated the First Amendment?
Unequivocally, yes.
And what's most shocking about all this is that the Biden administration was censoring facts simply because they disagreed with them. We know the vaccine did not stop catching COVID nor transmitting it, and we know the vaccine has had side effects. And the more we learn, COVID-19 came from that lab in Wuhan. They censored Americans because they did not like what they were saying. Attorney General Bailey, would you agree with that?
Yes, and I believe that in Dr. Anthony Fauci's deposition, he accurately characterized the president's position on this matter and his administration's position on this matter. Dr. Fauci could be characterized in his deposition as saying that if he disagrees with it, if he doesn't believe it to be true, then Americans shouldn't have free, fair, and open debate on that topic. And it's a scary world if the government gets to determine what is true rather than the citizens debating those topics and coming to the veracity of the claims on their own through free, fair, and open debate.
Unbelievable. Unbelievable. This history will not be kind to the tactics that the Biden administration used to censor speech in America simply because they disagreed with people's viewpoints. Especially now that history has shown that many of those dissenting voices were actually correct on not just their concern about the vaccine, but also their theory on the origin of COVID-19.